Hello students, and welcome to our next lesson on Colonial America, the Carolinas, cash crops, and slavery. Now remember, so far we have learned about two British settlements that eventually became, or one eventually became a colony in what we now call North America. We have the lost colony of Roanoke, and then of course what we've been learning about, Jamestown Colony. We also learned that the colonist largely responsible for the survival of Jamestown was John Smith. And we learned that John Smith and the settlers in Jamestown interacted with the Native Americans who were already there, which were the Powhatan people. We also know that there is a legend or a myth, which probably is partially true, that Powhatan's daughter, Pocahontas, pleaded with Chief Powhatan to spare John Smith's life at one point. We know that Pocahontas did not marry John Smith like in the Disney movie, but she ended up marrying another British colonist, John Rolfe. And he became important later on in the story of Jamestown. We know that when Jamestown was first established, the colonists faced challenges of illness, bad climate, water they couldn't drink, a lack of food and supplies, lack of organization, tension with the Native Americans. And we know that John Smith was a great leader. He helped run the colony by making sure they dug a well, they got their fort built, and he also forged pleasant and respectful relationships with the Native Americans. After John Smith had to go back to England, however, we had what's called the Starving Time, the winter of 1609 to 1610. Remember, the Powhatan kind of trapped the colonists inside their fort, and many of them starved and died of illness or cold. Now, when all the Jamestown colonists thought they were lost, another man came, John Rolfe, to their rescue with 3 British ships filled with supplies. Or excuse me, Lord de la Warr. Lord de la Warr came with the ships. John Rolfe was on the ships, and he figured out a way to grow tobacco in the colony of Jamestown, and tobacco ended up being something that really saved the colony of Jamestown. And we're going to talk more about the types of crops that helped these southern colonies get off the ground and be successful today. So as we've discussed, John Rolfe is well known for marrying Powhatan's daughter Pocahontas, also known as Mataoaka, and for making Jamestown and Virginia an important economic center. John Rolfe did this by growing and exporting tobacco and then shipping it out of the area to places that wanted to buy it. Now you may be thinking, yuck, because tobacco means smoking, and we know that that's a very unhealthy habit. Even land-greedy King James thought so. He once said that smoking is a custom loathsome to the eye, hateful to the nose, harmful to the brain, dangerous to the lungs. However, because many people still wanted tobacco and were willing to pay for it, tobacco became a huge part of the southern colonies' economy. The Spanish were actually the first to bring tobacco from Europe, or to Europe from the Americas. They had discovered that Native Americans in various parts of Central and South America used tobacco in a variety of ways. It was chewed, smoked, used as medicine, and was an important part of many religious ceremonies. In fact, when Christopher Columbus first set foot in the New World, he was greeted by local natives carrying gifts of fruit, spears, and dried leaves that had a strong fragrance. And those leaves we know now were tobacco. When the English arrived in North America, they too found that many Native Americans grew and used tobacco. The English settlers' get-rich plan had not succeeded when they failed to find gold. Some settlers had also experimented with growing crops, such as rice and grapes, but they too were unsuccessful. However, John Rolfe, with the guidance of Chief Powhatan, made a pivotal or very important contribution to the doomed Jamestown economy. Wealthy Europeans were beginning to develop a taste for tobacco. However, much of the tobacco being shipped to Europe had a bitter taste. John Rolfe introduced a new tobacco plant to the fields around Jamestown. He brought in a less bitter-tasting plant from the West Indies. Actually, he brought in the seeds to see if they would grow. It was an experiment, but it worked. The new tobacco plants grew and flourished in the red Virginia soil, and so the milder tasting Virginia tobacco became much sought after. Its increased use among the growing number of English smokers transformed the colony's economy. Jamestown became a place of wealth and enterprise. Shiploads of Englishmen and women eagerly set off to make their fortune there. The gold that the early settlers had sought turned out to be in the form of an odorous plant. Many people became wealthy as a result of growing this cash crop. Now, a cash crop is a large amount of produce grown to make money rather than to be used or eaten by the people growing it. No doubt, if you had been there in Jamestown, you might have heard the sound of golden coins jingling in the colonists' pockets. Tobacco was so popular that by 1619, only 9 years after the starving time, it had become Virginia's main crop. Within 50 years, the colony exported about 15 million pounds of it to Europe. Eventually, tobacco was such a widespread cash crop that the governor had to remind the settlers they should grow food crops also, so they had food to eat. With the success of the tobacco industry, the future of Jamestown was finally secured. However, there was one major drawback to growing tobacco. Back then, a lot of people were needed who were willing to work very, very hard to tend the large plantations, and people like that were not easy to find. In the beginning, the new tobacco farmers mostly had indentured servants working for them. Indentured servants were people who had agreed to travel to Virginia and other parts of North America to work for a period of time for a specific person. Their agreed upon time was usually 7 years. Usually, these indentured servants were poor people from England or other parts of Europe. Their ship passage was purchased for them by their employer. Then, as soon as they arrived at their new homes, the indentured servants were put to work to pay back the fare of the ship passage. These indentured servants labored long and hard in the tobacco fields. After the agreed upon time of service was up, and if they were still alive after the hardships many of them endured, they were set free to venture out on their own. In 1619, a Dutch ship arrived in Jamestown with what is believed to have been the first 20 Africans brought to North America. According to some historical accounts, these Africans were brought to North America as indentured servants, but they may have worked alongside white indentured servants. However, as the colony developed and there became a serious shortage of workers, colonists believed that the use of slavery was the most efficient way to manage plantations. Before long, thousands of Africans were brought to the colonies against their will and forced to work. Why did this terrible transition take place? Remember, the English had begun to lay claim to large areas of North America. After all, the Spanish were claiming most of Central and South America and even parts of Southern North America as their own. And the French had claimed much of Northern North America. Remember Champlain in Canada? So the English thought it was only fair that they claim huge chunks of land too. As you recall, England's very first attempt to colonize North America on Roanoke Island off the coast of present-day North Carolina failed, and it became known as a lost colony. But in 1663, Charles II, the son of Charles I and grandson of King James I, decided to try again near the same area. Charles II eagerly gave a charter, or an official document, to 8 of his friends that said the land between Virginia and the Spanish colony of Florida now belonged to him. Well, to England to be precise. Today, this land is North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, although Georgia was not officially colonized until much later. Charles II also named part of this land after himself. Can you guess which part? That's right, Carolina means Charles, or means of Charles. The Carolinas were named after King Charles II. This charter was extended until 1665 and more land was divided up among King Charles's friends to manage. Charles II was particularly generous to people who had helped his family when his father Charles I was killed. At that time, Charles II had been forced to flee to another country. When he was eventually allowed to return to England and take the throne, he owed a great deal of money to a great many people. His way out of debt was just to give them North America, or parts of it anyway. And having heard how successful Jamestown was, hundreds and then thousands of English flocked to the South and to the Carolinas in particular. In 1670, a busy seaport was established called Charlestown. I'm sure you can guess who Charlestown was named after. In the beginning, many colonists in the Carolinas established small farms, but before long, large plantations replaced small farms just for the purpose of growing cash crops. The top 3 cash crops in this area during this time were rice, tobacco, and indigo. You can see the rice in the bottom left-hand corner, the tobacco in the top left-hand corner, and the indigo on the right. Indigo was a plant used to make blue dye, which people favored for their clothing. The warm climate and marshy or wet stretches of land with fewer trees in the Carolinas was perfect for growing rice and indigo, whereas tobacco thrived in certain parts of North Carolina. With drier land and more trees, the geography and climate of Virginia was not good for growing rice and indigo. Tobacco was the only cash crop in Jamestown. As in Virginia, it soon became clear that there was a lot of money to be made in the Carolinas by growing crops. Many more workers were needed. Unfortunately, the solution the colonists chose was the extensive or widespread use of slavery. As you can imagine, no one volunteers to be enslaved. Unlike indentured servants who had a choice about going to work, enslaved Africans did not come to North America of their own free will as part of an exchange agreement, and they did not have any hope of ever being set free. Instead, they were taken by force. The roots of slavery go deep into the past. Remember, even the ancient Romans had slaves. Throughout history, powerful people have enslaved less powerful people. Although England began trading enslaved Africans later than some other European countries, it soon became one of the biggest slave trading countries due to the widespread use of slavery in the English colonies. For England, the African slave trade was part of a larger trade network among Europe, West Africa, and North America, including the colonies and the West Indies. Some of these trade routes became known as triangular trade routes. If you look at the map, you'll see why. Through these triangular trade networks, certain groups or goods were traded for much needed items. Enslaved Africans were simply thought of as goods that became part of the trade network too. You can see in the map that New England colonies here, traded timber, grain, tobacco, and rice with the British Isles. You can see that the British Isles sent iron products to Africa, and in turn, Africa would send captive Africans and gold to the New World. You can also see other items that were being traded in the opposite direction. And yes, there were African people who were paid by the British and European traders to lure other Africans to an area where they could be captured and put on a ship. English ships laden with iron products, especially guns, arrived in the West African ports to trade their goods for slaves and gold. Africans who became enslaved and previously lived freely in Africa were victims of kidnapping by the slave traders. Many of these raiders were Africans armed with guns supplied by European slave traders. Enslaved Africans were considered to be valuable workers. Captured Africans were loaded onto ships destined for parts of North America. This trade route from West Africa to North America became known as the Middle Passage. If the West Indies was their final destination, enslaved Africans were exchanged for goods like molasses and sugar that were then transported up to the southern colonies. Many other enslaved Africans stayed on the ship and were taken to the colonies along with the goods. Although there were enslaved Africans in all parts of the 13 English colonies, most enslaved Africans were sent to the South. This was because most farms in the Middle Atlantic and New England colonies were smaller and more easily maintained by families. However, some enslaved Africans in the cities worked in houses and shops as servants, skilled artisans, or craftsmen, like blacksmiths, carpenters, tailors, things like that. The business of enslaving and shipping captured African men, women, and children was a gruesome or terrible one. Captured Africans were packed like cargo onto ships where there was hardly enough room to move. Many were chained together or to parts of the ship. Very little food and water was provided, and the conditions were extremely unsanitary. There was no medical assistance for people who got sick. The journey itself could take 6 to 10 weeks to complete. The Africans had no idea where they were going and no idea if they would survive the journey. Although enslaved Africans were valued for their labor, the traders believed that there was just an endless supply of these workers. Therefore, if some people died along the way, the traders thought, we'll just replace them. Many captured Africans died before they even reached the Americas. When those who did survive reached the shore, they were marched off the ship in chains to be examined by prospective buyers, and then they were sold at auctions. There was very little regard for the humanity of these African men, women, and children. The main objective was to put them to work on plantations so they could make a lot of money for the Europeans. All right, students, after you have finished watching this video, please go into Jupyter and answer the questions that go along with what we just discussed.